Ah, how's it? Ready for chapter 8. Got my kettle boiled. Make some tea. Make sure to brew yourself a cuppa before you settle in and relax. Right, let that steep for a bit. Right, Stanborough Park Blues. My dental office is on the 6th floor of the old Mutual building, in the middle of Bulawayo. From my window in the sky, I can see prominent landmarks to the north. Dabadzinduna, the hill where King Lobengula's troops made their last stand against the English. Spears and shields were no match against Maxim guns and Lee Medfords. Ntabalikonyo, the hill you cannot point at, or else bad luck will come your way, so you only use your lips to point in that direction. The green snake of trees marking the Bembezi River. Any one of these landmarks are enough to send me on a mental trip that is difficult to disturb. School was the best time of my life, coos the lovely Miss Ashton, who has just finished at Rhodes University in South Africa. That certainly wasn't the case with me, I think to myself. Being a long-legged brunette and being built like a brick house probably had a lot to do with it, but the next patient was already being seated. Mrs. Robinson was an elderly lady, very demanding, and not without cause. She ran a farm on her own after her husband had been killed. Most of her beauty and charm have been masked by protective walls. I greet her and she doesn't return the greeting, but starts right in on all the wrong things dentists have done to her over the years. I'm still thinking about Miss Ashton, and wondering how she had managed to have such a good time at school. I look back out of the window, and the wheeling pied crows take me back to my first boarding school. I started school when I was 9.5 years old. There were no schools at all in our district, so I took a correspondence course that my folks had organized. I already knew how to do arithmetic from running my chicken business, and I already knew how to read, so school was a cinch. Mom would write out a program on how much I had to do each day, and I could go as fast or as slow as I liked. Afternoons were always spent hunting. By the time I was 12, I had completed the first 7 years of schooling without any effort, except English. I failed that on a regular basis, much to Dad's disgust. In order to civilize his bushman son, Dad thought it best to send his children to the very best, an English boarding school. My sister Patty and I must have looked like refugees arriving at Stanborough Park, the name of our future home. I had never worn shoes and only owned one pair that I had to wear on special occasions, like when the provincial commissioner came to visit, or when we went to see the Queen. I'd only ever worn shorts, a leather belt to carry my sheath knife, and a thin cotton shirt. When we arrived, it was in the middle of winter. The first place we were taken to was a department store, where we were fitted out with shoes, socks, uniforms, caps, blazers, scarves, long pants, and I even had to put on a pair of long johns, to which I actually became very attached due to the cold. To the extent that later, when we had to play cricket, I came out with my long johns on underneath my shorts. Right, just gonna sort my tea out here. Mm, mm. Get some sugar. Dash of milk. Cheers. The first night at Stanborough Park was very lonely and cold in a dorm full of strangers. I missed Mom terribly. Even though I was no longer allowed to sleep in her bed, she would still let me snuggle up to her sometimes, whenever I had something on my mind. I wished for the feeling of her tummy on my back, her warmth and security. I spoke to Patty about it at breakfast the next morning, and even though she was 2 years younger, she said she was fine, speaking to me in Swahili the whole time just to make me relax. I think she lied just to make me feel better. Classes the first day were a nightmare. Break time was even worse. I was so cold and needed to have a pee so badly. I went to the boys' toilet and couldn't figure out how to open my button fly. I ran out to the playground and found Patty. She took me into the girls' toilet and showed me how to warm my hands in the warm water first, and then it was easier to undo the buttons on my fly. When I came out of the girls' toilet, Mr. Jones, the boys' housemaster, saw me and called me over. "Taylor, what were you doing in the girls' toilet?" "Nilihitaji kuwa bwana," I replied. Patty immediately translated. "He had to pee, sir." Then she went into an explanation on cold hands, unfamiliar clothing, etc. It seemed as though they were getting on fine, and I drifted over to where the boys were. To say that I looked like a pork chop in a synagogue would have been an understatement. My culture was different, I spoke differently, my accent was different, and a lot of my expressions had originated from African dialects. This was an immediate license for bullying, taunting, and teasing. After being beaten up, I made a beeline for the woods, the only haven of safety I knew. I was lucky enough to find a secret hiding place. On the far side of the woods, an old car was completely covered in brambles. You could only get to it by crawling along on your hands and knees through a small tunnel. The car had been completely stripped and was missing the passenger door, but all the other doors were intact, as well as the windows and the back seat. It was dry, protected from the cold wind, and best of all, a place no one could find me. I felt lucky to have found such a place on my first visit to the woods. When I got to the playground, however, it was deserted. I had not heard the bell. I looked into each classroom and finally found my room, recognizing some of my classmates. I walked in, not even knowing which class it was. It happened to be a Latin class taught by Mr. Pell. He asked me where I had been. "I was lost, sir." He showed me to my seat and then asked me something in Latin. I could not speak a word of Latin and sat very still, looking straight ahead. He carried a 15-inch ruler with a brass edge. With this, he gave me a good whack on the head with the edge of the ruler, making a long gash in my head, producing a huge amount of blood. I knew all about head wounds, so quickly put on my cap to staunch the flow of blood and keep my uniform clean. This seemed to infuriate Mr. Powell even more, and he sent me to see Mr. Syme, the headmaster. I was ushered into his office by the secretary, and before I could read him properly, he told me to take off my cap. I bowed deeply from the waist and took off my cap. The blood poured onto the floor, and he stood up quickly, calling the secretary back. Between the two of them, they sorted out my head. 3 months later, when Dad came back to study in London, I mentioned the incident to him. Without a word, we went to school, and Dad marched straight into Mr. Syme's office while I waited outside. I could hear Dad talking in his low, no-nonsense voice. I never saw Mr. Powell again after that. Classes were all a blur, except for a certain Mr. Harry Leonard. He would sometimes stand on the desk, dance, sing, gesturing, wildly demonstrating a point, or throwing objects at different students. We all loved his classes, and today I still love history because of his classes, which were a bright spot in an otherwise boring, dull scholastic year. Break times, I would always attempt to escape to the woods. Often groups of boys would come out hunting for me. The first three times they found me and beat me unconscious. I would wake up long after the bell had rung and would be late for class again. I would always have to stay after class and explain what happened. One day, one of the boys that used to beat me up told me to meet him at break time. We went into the woods, and he told me he wanted to teach me how to fight. He saw I had strong legs, so he taught me to use them to my advantage. He spent a whole week teaching me, and then the next break, in front of everyone, he started to shout at me and punch me. I asked him quietly why he wanted to fight. "Fight, you little coward," he shouted. With that, he punched at my face. I grabbed his fist and pulled him on top of me as I fell backwards, getting him in a scissor grip around his neck with one leg and under an arm with the other. I bent his arm backwards at the elbow, just like he had taught me, and squeezed with all my might. He was screaming something, but I had never heard of giving up, so I choked him until everyone pulled me off. He had turned blue and was coughing quite badly. I wanted to thank him for teaching me so well, but he didn't speak to me for months. When the boys used to hunt for me in the woods, I would hide when I heard them coming. I would see him with them, and one time he looked up and saw me in the top of a tree, but he didn't say anything to the others. Strange boy, I thought. And then a miracle happened. Dad had been studying in Dublin, but decided he would rather study at the Royal College of Surgeons in London. After boarding for 3 months, we became day scholars, which was a lot better. Our family had always been very close, so it was good to get back into some of our familiar routines, like all piling into the folks' double bed at night and having Dad read us stories. The differences continued to follow me. Speaking as a male, customs about relieving oneself were also very different in England. Meryl and I recently went to our son's wedding in Switzerland. As it was quite chilly, we had to find restrooms often. Ladies were charged 1.5 francs to use the loo, and for man it was 1 franc. Converted on the parallel market, the black market, this was 80 Zimbabwe dollars just to perform a natural act. I was not about to fall prey to this sort of extortion, and stopped at the first grove of trees I came to. Halfway through my business, I noticed a police car pull up and 2 men got out. I quickly finished and was warned that as I was from Zimbabwe, I would be excused, but not to do it again, as there is a fine for this sort of crime. Every Wednesday afternoon was cricket at my English school. Even if it was a freezing day, which most were, we were to wear shorts, white shirt, and jersey. Much to Mr. Jones' disgust, I regularly wore my long johns underneath my shorts. Standing out on the field waiting for a stray ball is not only boring, but bitterly cold, as we had to stand in one given area. It was not long before nature took over, and all I did was walk to the edge of the woods to relieve myself. There began a whole lot of shouting and hooting from all the boys. Mr. Jones came over and took me by the ear. I was hauled off unceremoniously to the office and had to bend for the inevitable. Even the girls came up to me after that and asked if it was true that I had had a piddle on the cricket pitch. I found out the hard way that opening my mouth just gave them more ammunition, so I tended to keep it shut most of the time. Now, when Paddy and I became day scholars, Mom would make us eat Mom would make us each a lunch every day to take to school. This became the ultimate joke for all the students. They came with a sandwich or two, made of thin slices of white bread, cut from corner to corner, and wrapped in a wax paper. This was stuffed into the side pocket of a blazer. Patty and I came to school with large brown paper bags. In it was a bottle of milk, large slices of buttered homemade brown bread, ooh, lovely, tub of baked beans, another tub of casserole or patties, another tub of salad, cottage cheese with olive oil and salt sprinkled over the lot, and then some sort of pudding. This could be biscuits or cake or some baked pie. This mom, raised in the Congo, was not going to let her treasures go hungry. Sounds just like my mom, who was raised in Poland. The taunting was vicious and unending. On 2 occasions, my lunch sack was grabbed away from me and drop-kicked. Patty would come over and help me pick up what was left, and then we would sit apart from the others and eat together. This carried on for a month, and I just kept quiet the whole time. Then a strange thing happened. I can say it was the turning point of my stay in England. Monty Saxby, who was the class clown, came to school without his lunch. I saw him sitting without anything to eat, and in true African culture, asked him if he would like to share my lunch. He immediately sat down with me, and I showed him how to take the buttered bread, break off a piece, scoop out the baked beans, and pop it into his mouth without touching his lips. With his first bite, he leapt into the air, did a little dance, and shouted out how good it was. He sat down and ate more bread and beans, shared my salad, shoved whole patties into his mouth, and then ate half the pudding. He was so excited at the big lunch that he was almost crowing about it. The next day, lunchtime came, and there was Monty with a large brown paper sack. He must have given his mum very strict instructions, because his lunch was an exact replica of mine. It wasn't long before all the boys in my class were bringing big lunches to school. It was about this time that 2 of the bullies followed me into the woods at break time. They both got a good hiding and proceeded to preach the gospel to the rest of the class. That was the end of all physical abuse. Spring came, and the chestnut trees put on their new dresses, dogwoods bloomed in profusion, and the squirrels had their babies. I would climb up to their nests and play with them every chance I had. Life was good. Then there was the incident of the chicken. Whose chicken is that? I asked John Blackburn, a friend of mine that had discovered that I wasn't poison after all. It don't belong to anyone, he replied. I'd grown up using all the traditional hunting weapons, throwing sticks being one of them. One throws a club so that it spins, and the bird rises into the spinning club, breaking its neck. However, any sort of stick can be used if you are familiar with the principle. Before John knew what was happening, I had taken a broken hockey stick and thrown it, breaking the chicken's neck. "What are you doing, Taylor?" he gasped. I noticed that the English seldom call you by their first name. I noticed that the English seldom call you by your first name. "That's a pheasant. You're not allowed to kill them." "Well, we can't waste it now. Did anyone see us?" We were both busy looking around the empty field to see if anyone had seen what I had done. "Come with me and I'll show you how to cook it," I told John. He was a rosy-cheeked, red-haired, pudgy boy who lived a life of quiet desperation. He was glad I was around because it meant that the other boys didn't pick on him as much as usual. He was almost in a panic as I took him to my car in the chestnut grove. I made a fire where the driver's seat used to be, with some dry oak I had collected previously. I also kept 3 bricks there, as well as a wire grate. Salt, matches, and all my hunting gear were also stored there. All the feathers were plucked off the pheasant, and then I took out the innards, and just like my father had explained to me so many times, I explained to John what each organ was. He was fascinated but also terrified. "What if we get caught?" he kept murmuring. When the fire was only coals, I sectioned the pheasant into 8 pieces and sprinkled salt on each piece, putting them over the coals. John and I sat on the back seat and watched the pieces cooking. He told me of his father's shoe shop and how one day he was going to run it. I can tell you this too, Taylor, that this is the most terrible thing I have done in my life. His face was flushed, and he helped me to turn the pieces of pheasant with a piece of wire. I tried to comfort him, but it was of no use. After 3/4 of an hour of cooking had taken place, I took a piece and handed it to him. He took it in both hands and smelled it. Suddenly the fear was gone, and he lit up. He took a bite, and a miracle happened. He went from a red-haired, pudgy boy to a young man having the time of his life. "This is great, Taylor. Do you do this sort of thing in Africa?" He was beaming now, and already on to his second piece. "It's part of life where I come from. We kill, we cook, we eat. And if we can't cook, well, we still eat." I told him of my friend Arthur Sparrow, who's a bit older than myself, and how just before I came to England he had shot an eland. While we were skinning it, the trackers cut long pieces of meat and swallowed it, not to miss out on anything. Arthur and I had done the same. "You ate raw meat!" John almost shouted. "I actually know a man named July who can eat a whole impala raw," I informed him. "And the next day when he goes out into the bush to do his business, it looks like a lion pooed there." This was shocking to John. There were questions about lions, impalas, and in no time our pheasant was eaten. I wondered how long it would be before John told the rest of the school what we had done. But he never did. It was our secret between us, and he never mentioned it again. And he did seem to stand a bit taller from then on. I saw him take a bully by the disgusting name of Belcher one time in a headlock, and squeezed him so hard that Belcher had a serious attitude adjustment after that. Once in a while, John would sit next to me while I ate my big lunch. He was also bringing big lunches by then. "So, what are you cooking in your car these days, Taylor?" "I've discovered chestnuts. I've been eating them raw, but they are much better roasted," I informed him. He had this habit of peering at me over the top of his gold-rimmed glasses. "What else?" He was smiling this big smile as he peered at me in a benevolent fashion. "I'm a young man now. I have my own pair of long pants and a jacket. I'm visiting that rogue friend of mine, Arthur Sparrow, again. He never went to boarding school in England. The schools he did go to usually asked him to leave before long anyway. Nonetheless, he had heard all my stories. I knew something was up. With Arthur's strange sense of justice, there is always something in the offing. We had been invited to a big party at the club. It was to be a black coat and tie affair, as the provincial commissioner was going to be there with his wife. Sheep had been roasting over a slow fire all day. The ladies had been bustling in the kitchen the whole afternoon. A table in the shape of a T had been set, with all the finest cutlery to be found in that part of Tanganyika. Place names had been set with the PC at the head of the table, and people in descending order according to class and position were placed at the opposite end, where Arthur and I were. Arthur had no black shoes, and so he wore his mosquito boots. As soon as we arrived, he was told he wasn't allowed to wear his mosquito boots, and that he could trade with one of the cooks in the kitchen. This he did, but wasn't very happy about it. I saw him I saw him fidgeting in his pocket, and then his face lit up. Out of his pocket, he took a condom. He grabbed a bottle of mayonnaise and poured some of this into the condom, tied it with a bit of string, and threw it into this pot of soup when the cook wasn't looking. Sis, man. With a look of glee, he went striding out of the kitchen with me in tow, and wearing the cook's black shoes. I now recalled how John Blackburn must have felt on that day when we ate the pheasant. I was in quite a panic, but Arthur didn't seem to mind at all. The PC arrived in a Rolls Royce. He had on this type of helmet, with long white feathers joined at the top and hanging down to the brim. He didn't take his hat off either when he shook hands with guests, something we thought terribly rude. For 2 hours we ate hors d'oeuvres, drank numerous cocktails, and in general everybody was pretty tanked by the time dinner started. Soup was the first course, and Arthur was like an eagle watching everyone. I got a quick nudge and followed Arthur's gaze to a lady 3 down from the PC. She was fiddling with a string in her mouth. With her fingers just so, she pulled the condom full of mayonnaise out of her mouth and let it dangle there for some seconds trying to figure out what it was. Then the message finally hit, and she projectile vomited 2 hours of hors d'oeuvres and cocktails straight across the table onto the gentleman across from her. We both, in a most uncultured manner, guffawed, leapt out of our chairs and disappeared into the night. We had had enough of high society, and after recovering Arthur's mosquito boots, we went back to Arthur's house, where we ate sadza and relish. "Whatever possessed you to do that, Arthur?" I asked as we were eating. "The PC. He's English." Arthur sits there, looking at me as though I should be able to read his mind. "What on earth has that got to do with it?" I asked, completely stymied. "The PC is English. Now you're even for them teasing you at boarding school." Alright. Sure, that was a long chapter. Alright, well, I hope you enjoyed that, and good night, sleep well, and see you tomorrow.